Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's the Freemanjack show on TNS Radio and Scottish Sovereigns on the Land. This evening we have an absolute explosive show for you. I'm being co-hosted with the fabulous Bitchin' Bob, because he's been my most incredibly efficient PA at bringing the amazing Dr. Tom Campbell, he of the author of the My Big Toe Theory, physicist, author, metaphysicist, philosopher. Would I be pushing that too far?
That's fair.
Thank you. In my mind, possibly the most influential physicist to have walked this earth since Einstein, and I really do not mean that as faint praise. I read Einstein as a very young man. He did a popularist version of relativity, and I can honestly say I haven't been hopping from foot to foot quite as much as since I delved into relativistic time and curved space-time theory. Good evening, Bob. Good evening, Tom. Thank you so much for being able to join us.
Thank you, Jack. Glad to be here.
Yeah, Jack. Wonderful.
This is just an amazing, amazing opportunity for us all, I hope. Right, Tom. I would really, I suppose I need to impress on people that what you've got to bring to the air is not necessarily complex, but it does require a certain degree of explanation of certain fundamental kind of experiments into quantum physics, into certain fairly scientific terminology. I'd like to reassure people that Tom is the most wonderful speaker and is clear and concise and uses largely language that the common man can grasp. I hope that both myself and Bob will act as the ear of the common man, and if there's terminology that perhaps Tom's having to rely on, that we think that the audience may not quite be up to speed with, perhaps we'll ask Tom to elaborate a little more on terms. But I see tonight's programme largely as a lecture from yourself, Tom. It's a subject that you're so very comfortable with describing that I'd really like for myself and Bob to take a back seat in this show and to kind of really give you a full platform for the next 3 hours. If you'd like to break at any time, I'll have music lined up, so if you need to be called away, I'll have a backup plan so we can keep the listeners happy while you're away. If we can possibly stop perhaps on the hours, if we haven't stopped before, just so that we can have a comfort break and to let the listeners enjoy their comfort as well, if that's okay with you, gentlemen.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, fabulous. All right, well, perhaps an introduction to yourself, your history, how you ended up in the field that you ended up in.
Well, as you said, I'm a physicist, and I'm one of those unusual people, I guess, that has lived in two worlds. I got out of graduate school, and within a year or so, I had run into Bob Monroe. Bob Monroe wrote Journeys Out of the Body. And he had just built a laboratory to study consciousness. I had done some meditation, and that's about as far as I had gone. But I joined with Bob to study consciousness, and the deal was that Bob Monroe would teach me, and another friend of mine was doing this as well, Dennis Menerick, would teach us out of body, and as much as he knew about the larger reality system, and we would, man his lab, if you will, with scientist. The other fellow was a double E, electronic engineer, and so we did. We made that arrangement, and Dennis and I would build equipment and set up experiments and execute them and that sort of thing to make sure that we had good scientific protocol. And Bob would come up and spend 2, 3, 4 hours with us in booths teaching us what he knew. So did that for quite a few years, and learned a lot. Bob was a good teacher, and probably a year or so, going out of body on demand whenever you felt like it became an easy thing to do. And then we began to kind of explore the larger reality system. So I'm a physicist, and at the same time had this experience. Kind of my night job was working in a consciousness research laboratory. So it's the melding of those two experiences, I guess, that's kind of led me to where I am now, to the path that I've gone down. Well, being a physicist, what physics is a trying to understand how reality works. That's kind of the simplest definition of physics. It's modeling reality. So as a physicist, what I wanted to do is understand, how does it all work? How do things fit together? How does this larger non-physical part of this reality connect to the physical part? And what can you do in this non-physical part? What are the limits, and why are the limits, the way they are? And just every question you can imagine. In other words, take it apart and see how this thing works. So that was my job, and I stayed focused on that job for the next, 30, 35 years. And eventually, when I kind of came to conclusions that I had a good logical understanding of the process and of the larger reality, then I wrote these books. It's a trilogy called My Big Toe, and it's three books. It actually started out as one, but got so big that that would have been silly to try to put it into one cover. It would have been bigger than a dictionary, I think. So yeah. I made 3 books out of it, and that's the results of my personal research and experimentation with consciousness. So that's kind of the very short story of who I am and how I got here. And I guess the ending to that is that I did actually find an explanation, a logical way to put it all together and understand how the larger reality works. Now, this larger reality, we're a part of it. We here in this physical reality are a piece of that larger reality. And as it turns out, if you understand the larger reality, you can derive all the rest from it. So you can actually derive physics from this larger understanding. You can derive metaphysics from it. You can derive morality and ethics from it. You can derive theology from it. All of those things fall out as logical consequences of this overall understanding. So that's kind of the bottom line with My Big Toe.
Okay, I'd like to also point out for anybody hearing you referring to your books and hearing me referring to you as an author earlier, one of Tom's provisions of coming on today's show was that the recorded audio would be freely available, which of course it is through TNS, and that the recording wouldn't be monetised in any way. And I'd just also like to point out that all 3 of Tom's books are kindly freely available on Google Books if you'd like to go and reference those. And I think that's an admirable move for an author to make, to allow their material to be fully open sourced like that.
Yeah, and all of the workshops that I have done, at least all that I have video footage for, are all on YouTube. So all of the time, every time I make an appearance and I get video footage, then that goes up on YouTube, of course, which is free as well. So the idea is to let people know, be an open source so that people can, who are searching, trying to understand what life is about. What's the meaning of life? All the big questions. Well, no sense keeping a wrap over them. You might as well let the people who are searching have access.
Okay. And could you just give a brief outline of your working life? I know that you've worked with some fairly historic agencies over your working career as a physicist.
Yes, when I said I got out of graduate school and took the first job, which is what led me to Bob Monroe, that actually was a job in Army Technical Intelligence. That means that what I did was made mathematical models of foreign equipment. Let's put it that way. Foreign equipment to see how it worked, how it could be beaten, how it might beat us, that kind of thing. So it was modeling in a computer complex pieces of equipment. That was my first job, and that's the job I had while I was going out and working in Monroe's laboratory. So that was number one, and then I changed that and went on the other side. Instead of a government employee, I went to the contract side and worked for an engineering company that was, it hired out engineering talent for a lot of causes, but mainly the one I was involved in was missile defense. And sometimes people take me to task for that. They say, how could you work in missile defense? But they have to understand that defense is defense. This was all about how you can render nuclear warheads ineffective. It was the way to defend against nuclear warheads was the idea. So if somebody shoots a warhead at you, you can knock it down, or you can make it so they can't shoot it in the first place, or whatever. It was a way to reduce that particular threat, which seems to me like a good thing.
Well, might I suggest as well that in the climate of the time, am I assuming that we're talking 1960s here?
We're talking 1970s, but it was still the same.
So the Cold War would have still been very hot at the time.
Cold War was on, that's kind of time it was. But the technology that you have to develop for missile defense is not at all like the technology you would develop for missile offense. So they're completely different. The offensive missiles and equipment, that's like a dump truck. It was just a big, massive rocket that delivers a heavy payload. That's the offense. And all of their technology goes into how big a payload can it carry and how accurate can it hit the point you shoot it at. That was their technology challenges. If you're going to build something that's going to hit that warhead as it's coming in at, Mach 5 or Mach 10 or something like that, now you've got the problem of hitting a bullet with a bullet. Somebody shot a bullet at you, and it's going very fast, and it's not very big, and you have to hit it with another bullet. So it's a completely different sort of technology involved. So the two parts of DoD, one offense and one defense, rarely had any conversations and didn't talk to each other, didn't share technology. They were just totally separate parts that didn't really communicate with each other. So on the defensive side, of course I wasn't then in the government, I was a contractor, but on the defensive side, it was basically trying to discover and create new technology, because the fact was we couldn't do that. We couldn't hit the bullet with the bullet. It was all just a plan that we would try to work toward and see if it couldn't be accomplished. So mostly what we were doing was research, design, test, that sort of thing. It was many years later that a rough kind of system came out of it, and that's still pretty rough now. So it's a very hard thing to do, and it required a lot of creative work to do it. And the other point that I make to people who have a problem with me working for DoD is that you can change things more significantly from the inside than you can from the outside. As long as you stay outside the organization, you can holler and shake your fist and carry a sign, but all that does is tends to harden the attitude on the inside. So you're much better off if you can get in the inside and then talk and be a good example and kind of spread a little peace and light on the inside. That is so much more effective than being too good to get to the inside and then shaking your fist at it and calling it names. That doesn't help at all. So all in all, it was a good career. I did that for a fairly long time, a decade or two, and then went to NASA, where I had worked on a whole series of problems. By then, I was a consultant, and the problems I worked on would change from contract to contract. And generally, I'm in an area of large-scale, shall we say, risk analysis. So you have a huge system, like the system that launches people out into space, sends them to the moon and whatever. This is a huge system, and what are the risks? What are the vulnerabilities? What are the possibilities of things that could go wrong? Well, there's 10,000 piece parts to a thing like this, and there's probably 3,000 different contractors. All the piece parts have to fit together, and the systems are so complex that if something goes wrong in part A, that creates a problem in part B, which does something to part C, and about 10 levels down, something blows up. So it's not always clear what can affect what and what the probability is of that happening. And that's the kind of area that I worked in. So it was big computer simulations of large systems to see how all the piece parts connected and talked and interacted with each other with the idea of coming up with how to make the thing, one, safe for the people to ride in it, and two, so that it would complete its mission and do the science or do whatever it was supposed to do, and there wouldn't be failures in it. So I did that then as a consultant.
On that point,
that's
Tom,
a field that not a lot of people are in. So I would, as a consultant, I would get calls because they had problems they couldn't solve themselves. Otherwise, they wouldn't call a consultant because consultants are expensive. So they just called consultants when the problem was a difficult one, which means I got to work on just the most fun problems. So that's kind of what I did in my career as a physicist. And actually, I just stopped doing that. I've retired several times, and this last time I'm hoping it sticks. I've been turning down those consulting because I'm done with that, and it's all I can do to keep busy with the 100, 150 emails I get every day. So there's just a lot to do now besides doing radio interviews and going places to speak. I'm going to be in Portugal in the first part of November. And then about 3 months later, I'll be in Spain. And so it's just been a lot of fun traveling around, talking with people, and making more videos that go up on YouTube.
I was just minded there, Tom, that when you were mentioning about the potential failure rate of those the numbers of components that are stacked together in these rocket launches and stuff, I remember a fabulous quote from, I think it was one of the first ever Apollo launch pilots. Saying that when he was sitting on the top of the Apollo waiting to take off, it crossed his mind that it was sitting on top of 1.5 million components, all made by the lowest competitive bidder.
That's right. That's exactly right. Wow. Because everybody doesn't have quite enough money to do the job right. So all of the engineers are trying to get by with as low cost as they can.
So Tom,
that's the way it works.
Sorry, Tom. Could I ask you a question with regards my big toe, and how do your peers, in your field of work, how are they responding to, to what the information that you're giving out? How do they feel about it?
Well, for the most part, the two jobs, the day job and the night job, if you will, have been separate. When I'm at, when I was at work doing my physicist thing, the people there just knew me in that context. So I was the guy that could solve hard problems and come up with solutions, and that was kind of what they knew about me. Yeah. Physicists are kind of jack of all trades. Engineers build very specific things, and there's very specific kinds of engineering, the mechanical and the electrical and so on. But physicists kind of have a general sense of how things work, and therefore we get kind of the big picture jobs. But that was that changed. This last contract I had with NASA, I was working with a bunch of young folks, and I usually do that because I do the algorithms on the software, what it is we're going to program and how we're going to program it. But I need 2 or 3 young engineers or programmers to do the programming for me. It's just not cost effective for me to spend my time making code. Rather, I spend my time making algorithms, and others then put that into code. So I tend to work with young people a whole lot, which I like. And a couple of these young people, they kind of looked at me first couple of days, and about a week or so after I'd been there, one of them said, "Are you the Tom Campbell that was on Coast to Coast Radio, years back?" And I go, "Yeah, that would be me." And pretty soon, almost all of the young people I worked with, had a little group. They'd come in and at lunchtimes, they were from beginning to end, they were asking questions, and they were interested, and they wanted to know about this, and they wanted to know about that. So my cover had been blown then. The older people I worked with before that, they didn't know. They wouldn't have been listening to the stuff that I was, they wouldn't have listened to, Coast to Coast, probably just wasn't their cup of tea. So when I finally got around enough young people, then my cover was blown. And that worked out very well. At first I was a little wondering, how's this going to work out? We're going to have any problems here, but there were no problems at all. It was terrific. They were all great people, and so the two mixed very well then. I stand pretty much on my reputation and on what I do. In that world, you're judged by what you produce. Okay. And for that matter, in that world, you're not even judged so much on the degrees that you have or any of your certification. You're just judged on what can you produce. Here's the big problem. Can you solve it? Can you come up with conclusions? Can you build us a system that will do what we want it to do? And if the answer is yes, that's all they need to know. They don't need. They don't really care a whole lot about how many degrees you have after your name or anything else. If you can do it, you're in. So my reputation, is basically based not on me as a consciousness explorer, but just what I can produce in the physics world.
Well, your reputation as a consciousness explorer, I can absolutely assure you, is one of the most credible that I have yet to come across in any of my interviewees or any of my potential interviewees. Being an alternative researcher, I am in the habit of doing negative research, where I will put in a particular guest's name and use a negative search term, fraud, conspiracy, corruption, whatever, after their name, and have a sift through the results. And with nearly all of my scientific guests who have presented theories that are outside of the mainstream scientific view, you can usually find fairly wide-scale, scathing criticism of their work. And I was so refreshingly reassured by the almost complete absence of any sentient criticism of your work. And the only criticisms that I could find on the internet generally started, I watched the first 10 minutes of Tom's video.
Yeah, that's it. That's right.
And I'm not prepared to read any further after that point. If they're not prepared to listen any further, I'm not reading past that point. So they could have made the most eloquent criticism of your work based on the first 10 minutes of a video, but I wasn't interested in reading it.
Well, that's good to hear. I'm surprised at that because, there are quite a few physicists who are not that open-minded and who, hearing my theory, would just kind of shut down and say, well, that's impossible. That couldn't be that way, and then turn off and leave. But that's probably the one that left after the first 10 minutes, I guess.
Exactly.
So you would have some of those. But I've also been pleased that most of the lectures I give, most of the workshops I give, there'll be a smattering of technical people in there, physicists and engineers and people that program and computer scientists, that sort of thing, and mostly it's a love-in. We get along real well, and they're pleased to finally get the things that they've always thought were so, but couldn't ever come to a logical derivation of them, and now finally they had a logical derivation. They were generally thrilled. So it's been good most of the time. I haven't had any what we say, hecklers, hanging out on the sides, making trouble in any of these groups. Mostly it's been people who are very happy to get the explanation.
Well, certainly the explanation for me has come very much as almost although I had already largely recovered my sanity, has come as a sanity saver for someone such as myself. As you know, my personal interest in science goes right back into my youth. Read Einstein at a very early age, was fascinated by the burgeoning science of quantum physics as we were sort of moving into the 70s. Consumed just about everything that I could, New Scientist and sort of Nature and sort of astrophysics and what have you. But I was also a temporal lobe epilepsy sufferer. And so accidentally I stumbled into the same realms that you were probably entering through your transcendental meditation. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in the absence of the tag of the transcendental to attach to it, I found the physical model that the scientists that I admired so much were constructing for me to describe my reality with was incongruent with the extremities of my reality, because when I had my temporal lobe epilepsy, although I left the here and now, the now that I would find myself in was equally as linear, equally as real. I would be walking around as a 5'8" man looking out of two eyes with two arms and two legs. Not that I ever actually saw my arms and legs, but you know what I mean. I had no perceptual difference between where I had found myself and where I had been, except for that it was locality transposed.
Yeah. Well, it's good that you were able to have that and not succumb to the not succumb to the opinion that your vision or your experience was false.
Well, what I always, from my youth, I always dismissed any experience that I had while in a fit as dreamlike or as imaginary until about 25 years ago. I had an enormous 3.5, 4 minute fit in which I most likely sort of physically died in the room, but the place that I went to was the most clear and vivid rendering of the place that I actually was, but at a completely different time frame. And although, again, when I returned from the fit, I did my usual trick of emotionally separating myself and shrugging off the experience, a few weeks later I met a local vicar, and through this vicar was able to establish that I had actually seen a house that had burnt down over 100 years before, and the only data about that house's description was actually in the vicar's loft in a dusty box. The poor vicar turned white and nearly dropped on the spot with me describing the old vicarage that he knew of no record of other than the one that was in his loft, and no way that I could possibly have known about it. And that was one of several experiences of that year of a similar kind of... there was a corroboration in this reality frame that said that there was something more to the experience than imagination or invention.
Yeah, that's a very big point to come to. That, I've done. I did the same thing when I was working with Monroe. Of course, in my mind, it was always, "Is this true? Is this true, or is this just some trick of my, my mind and my imagination, sort of thing?" Even though we had tons of data piled up with, like you said, things we had seen that we checked on later that were true, and facts that we had pulled out, and numbers we'd read off of blackboards in another room. We had a lot of that data, but until you have an experience like you've just described, where there absolutely is no wiggle room other than, it's real. That was a real experience. It just wasn't in this reality. You kind of have this doubt that it might not be true. And it seems like it is, but you just still don't quite believe it. And then one day you have an experience like that where you just can't any longer have that doubt. It's clear. And then that kind of changes the way you see the world from then on.
Yeah, it's a game changer.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that, because in the absence of knowledge of your sorts of research, although I was aware of a lot of the kind of psi research going on from the 60s, I've followed Rupert Sheldrake's career since the campus experiments with Timothy Leary and the prisoner experiments, and through his morphogenic field stuff. So I'm very much aware of the field of kind of psi experimentation, but without the clear-cut constructs that the MBT gives us, I had to rely on the world of mysticism, the occult writings, to gain any sort of a meaningful explanation for the experience that I'd just had. And even then, the so-called meaningful explanation was wrapped within the framework of kind of sacred texts, or of dualistic layered meanings and things like this. And it really just it was too fuzzy for me. I'm a mechanic. I like spanners. I like a nut that tightens on a bolt through a washer and holds a piece of metal together. And without that mechanistic sense of a construction where I could see a means of describing where I am now to how I got to where I was then, it literally led me to the point of madness, where I doubted my every sense, because everything seemed to have been turned upside down without that framework to be able to realise exactly what had happened, and it's obvious now to me that I'd just lost the sort of time code signal.
Right. Yeah, I hear that a lot from people. Almost all of my workshops, people will come down to me and say, you know what I got out of your book that was the most important thing? And I'll always kind of wonder what that is, and they'll say, I learned that I'm not crazy. And
yes.
It's because they've had these experiences, and they keep having them, and many of them have had them for years, but they've always feared that they had a part of them that was kind of spontaneously insane, and they would have these experiences, and then when they hear a logical explanation for those experiences, it's a huge relief. So I do hear that a lot. You know, people like Rupert Sheldrake, you mentioned him, and of course Bruce Lipton.
Fabulous.
Also, both of those create theories that explain the data that they have gotten. But what MBT does, and MBT, for your listeners, is short for My Big Toe, what the My Big Toe Trilogy does is it builds a solid theoretical framework under their experiments. So, yes, their experiments were true, and they showed things that are accurate. Their discoveries are good ones, but they also didn't have a foundation, a good scientific foundation to build it on. They kind of start in the middle and end up with phenomena that they can reproduce that are real. But when somebody says, well, how does that work? You know, where does that come from? Why does it have to work that way? They don't know. It's just, well, it does. My experiments say that it works, but they don't have a theory. And this kind of builds a foundation, if you will, under folks like them that have been, have discovered the logical ramifications, but not the foundation.
So has our understanding of quantum physics and mechanics or whatever, that evolution of our knowledge base, that's been a very important step towards our understanding now of consciousness, as you would say it in MBT.
Ask me that again.
Sorry, I was saying that we've MBT come about because of we have nowadays the understanding of quantum physics, and that evolution of understanding has let us know that we're actually closer now to understanding consciousness. Is that, has quantum physics become part of the journey to get there?
Yes.
All right.
Yes, that's true. Well, when I wrote the My Big Toe Trilogy, I had intended it to be an explanation of the larger consciousness system. It's kind of a theory of consciousness, a theory of reality, and that was its intention. And then when I got done, I had the epiphany that the same facts, the same structure that explained consciousness and the larger consciousness system, paranormal, all the rest of it, it also explained physics, that it came with the same ideas, also logically deduced why quantum mechanics, works the way it does. Why are particles probability distribution? It also, you can derive, why does C have to be a constant? Einstein's relativity is based on C being a constant. It derives lots of those kinds of basic physical principles upon which modern physics is built. And physics has been going by kind of winging it with no foundation under their work either, just like, Rupert and Bruce. They start with assumptions. Einstein's assumption, C is a constant. And they say, well, why is C a constant? And, of course, the answer is, well, don't know, but it is. And given that it is, we get relativity. And why should particles be probability distributions? Why should the double-slit experiment work the way it works? And, of course, the answer is, well, we don't know, have no idea, but that's how it works. And once you realize that it's probability, then you invent this mathematics of quantum mechanics that will take that fact and derive logical consequences of it. Yes. So I've not only built a foundation under Rupert Sheldrake and Bruce Lipton and a dozen others who have all the parapsychological research, that sort of thing. The people out at Paralabs, they don't understand why they get what they get either. So this kind of builds the missing link, the missing foundation underneath of science, fundamental science like quantum mechanics and relativity, as well as applied science like what's going on at Paralabs at Princeton. So it forms that rock for them to stand on.
Tom, you've just segued me beautifully into my next loose bullet point. And that's, I've heard you speak about scientists having slightly lost focus of the fact that the model that they are mapping is only the map, and they appear to have become confused between the map and the landscape. And so I'd like to take you into the subject of the scientific method and the value of imperfect models.
Yes. Science have fallen into the same logic trap that metaphysicians have, and that is they come up with models. They model something, and their models have to do with measuring how something interacts with their sensors, their equipment. Okay, so they measure the should we say the reaction of something with their equipment. That's what measurement is, and then they come up with a model. If they left it at that, they'd be all right, because they would just have a model. A model is kind of a tenuous thing. This is how we think, this thing might work. But instead, after a decade goes by, they begin to believe that their models are reality. And once they believe that their model isn't a model, but it's actually what is happening, then they end up confusing themselves. For instance, look at the electron. Now, the electron is a very pedestrian particle these days, right? It's been around for, 50 or 60 years, and they've been measured. We know, how much charge they carry. We know, the amount of mass they carry. We know, we used to know, their diameter and things like that. These are all measured. So here's this electron, this little chunk of matter, and it has charge, and we've seen it on an oil drop experiment that Millikan did probably late 1800s, early 1900s that measured the charge, that sort of thing. So we say, well, that's it. It's an electron. It's this little chunk of matter, and here's its characteristics, and here's what it does. That's a model, not the thing. But they began then to believe that was real, and that their model was in fact the thing. It's like the difference between the map and the territory. The model's like the map. And there's a big difference between the map and the territory. There's a big difference between the effect of a thing and the thing itself. All they're measuring is the effect of the thing. The effect of, measuring this oil drop that Millikan did in his famous oil drop experiment, which found the charge of an electron. So you're measuring, the motion of an oil drop, and you're inferring an electron. So the model has an inference, but the inference is not real. So what happens when we get down to the quantum mechanical level is that the electron isn't at all like we imagined it. It's not this little chunk. The electron does the same kind of, reaction to the double-slit experiment as does light. So here we have this electron that's just a probability distribution. It's not a hard, massy thing at all. Otherwise, how could it make a wave pattern? You see, how do little chunks of matter make wave patterns? Yeah. So it's not just a little chunk of matter. It acts like a little chunk of matter sometimes, but sometimes it acts not at all like matter. And then they realized that their model that they thought was true, was not true. So then they make up, now it's really a math model. People will tell, quantum mechanics, theorists will tell you right away that nobody understands quantum mechanics. We don't know how it works. Nobody ever will understand quantum mechanics, but this is the mathematics that computes logical consequences. And they've given up on understanding how it works. They think it's impossible, but it's not. It's very simple. It falls right out of this theory, how it works, why it works, and it's not impossible at all. It's just that you have to kind of get out of the belief trap, kind of get out of the box, as they say, in order to see the solution, because the solution is not physical. It's about consciousness. It's about information. It's not about physical reality and little chunks of matter. So that's been a box that scientists have trapped themselves in for for a very long time.
And I've heard you speak about, like I say, the value of these imperfect models, that simply that your theory isn't overwriting any of these previous theories, but is in fact supporting most of them, and is merely a larger subset of these individualized theories, and that the imperfect models, the flat Earth theory, is still a perfectly applicable model to use if you're working on a certain scale.
That's correct. The physics, if you look at physics from a kind of a historical viewpoint, you'll see that the way, well, I shouldn't say physics, just science in general, before even it was called physics, I guess, you'll see that what happens is that there are models and there are theories, and then we get information that tells us that the theory is wrong. Then eventually we get understanding to see where it's wrong, how it's wrong. We take a step up, and then we look back. The old model doesn't just disappear and get thrown out. The old model usually is a pretty good model within a constrained area. You know, it works within these conditions and not outside of it. And we see that all the time. So the flat Earth is a very good example of that. The Earth was flat for a long time. Then we found out it was round, but we didn't throw out the flat Earth. We still use it today. All the surveying that's done, say you lay out your home and a surveyor comes, or an office complex or something like that, it's all laid out based on a flat Earth model. That's how surveyors work. They don't take into consideration that the Earth is a curve, has a curved surface. So it's still a good model where the distances are short, because the Earth's curvature is so minuscule, so slight. When you're just going, a mile here or a mile there, you don't notice it. Uh-huh. So it's still a good model. But now you have a bigger model, and the old model is a subset. It's an approximation within. It's subsumed by the newer model. And then that happened again with relativity and quantum mechanics. You got relativity and quantum mechanics, and suddenly the old model, which was Newtonian mechanics, wasn't right anymore. We saw where Newtonian mechanics was wrong, but most all the physics done today outside of universities is done in Newtonian mechanics still. It's unless you have very, very small things you're concerned with, or very, very fast things you're concerned with, Newtonian mechanics is a perfectly good approximation. But we look back and we can see that it's approximation. And now with the my big toe understanding of reality, the same thing happens again. We can look back at relativity and quantum mechanics, and we can see how they're limited. They're only limited to that part of reality where the uncertainty is small. That's the part that approximates objective reality. So things happen objectively. They, if you do them once and then do the experiment again, you'll get the same result. This idea of objectivity holds in that part of the reality where uncertainty is naturally small. And relativity and quantum mechanics and Newtonian mechanics are all subsets of this larger understanding. But yet the larger understanding then opens you up another view of the world, which I call the larger consciousness system, where it's the bigger reality, and relativity, quantum mechanics now are a subset, an approximation within a larger thing, and they're subsumed by this larger understanding. So that's just the nature of breakthrough. That's the nature of paradigm change in science, is that the old becomes a subset of the new, and that's the way this has worked. So with my theory, it's not that you have to throw out quantum mechanics and relativity, or Newtonian physics for that matter, or the flat Earth. All of those are good approximations within their own limited worldview.
Just for the listeners' sake, just to qualify, you were saying that most physics that's used in the outside world is Newtonian, and that quantum physics tends to be the realm of the research laboratory and the college. But just to qualify that to the listener, if you want to know the practical application of quantum mechanics. Everybody that is listening to this will be listening to it through a device that is constructed out of transistors and microprocessors, and those are all entirely reliant on the results of quantum calculations being repeatable and reliable. If quantum mechanics and quantum physics didn't work, then the modern computer wouldn't work, and even right back to the old transistor radio would have been a technology unavailable to us without an understanding of quantum physics.
Yes, that is so. Even the old lowly diode, that's just a very common circuit component. Those tunneling diodes are is a quantum mechanical effect, and tunneling diodes have been around, I don't know, about as long as electronics has been around. So.
Okay, well, I'm minded that we're approaching our first hour. I think that's it's with this subject. I think finding convenient breakpoints is probably more important than hitting times precisely. What I'd really like to do after taking a very short music break would be to perhaps come back with a full description of your theory of everything.
Okay.
Would that be? Is that okay with everyone?
Sure.
Fabulous.
Excellent.
Okay. Well, we'll just go to a tune for about 4.5 minutes, and we'll be back just shortly. Then we're back on air. And it's freemanjack and Bitchin' Bob with the fabulous Dr. Tom Campbell, author of My Big Toe, and that's where we're going to go now. Hello, gentlemen. Glad to have you back. And so far we've discussed taken a fairly ponderous introduction to Tom himself, Tom's work and history, and hopefully illustrated why this theory is important, and of just exactly the magnitude of that importance. So I'd really like to give Tom the floor now, simply to give his, I suppose, 1 hour take on my big theory of everything.
Well, we'll maybe do it in pieces. When you say 1 hour take, everybody just got up to do something else.
Oh, Tom, you'd be surprised. My listeners are entirely used to content of this sort of nature, and I can assure you that since we were about to come on air, the chat box on TNS filled up, and the chat box is always an exponential reflection of the listenership. So the fact that it was being publicised that you were coming on substantially, probably 25% increase in listenership just a few minutes before you came on air. So really, sir, please don't think that you need to hide your light under a bushel. We have a very adult listenership and a very enlightened one.
Good. Yeah. Now, taking an hour to explain the basics of the theory, of course, is hard. When I stand up at my workshops, it takes a day. I do theory in about 7 or 8 hours. So this will be a little on the short side, in as much as I can give you the kind of a series of bottom lines, and then you can maybe ask me some more questions if you think there's something that's particularly hard to understand. But when you see the whole thing, when you actually get it, it's really very simple. You said that when we first started this. It is very simple, but you have at least 2 or more paradigms to leap to get by, and those are difficult. They're hard to do. Your habits of thinking just keep pulling you back into kind of the same traps again. It's kind of difficult to get there. The first paradigm that you have to jump is the idea that reality is information. Okay, reality is information. Now, to help people get that, I make a little analysis of their senses. Your reality, what you think of as reality, is what we call physical reality, and all that is information. Here's how. When you look, let's say, take the eye sense, take the sight. When you look, you're getting light that creates a little pulse of neurons. You get a little electrical signal at the retina, where the lens focuses the light on the retina. The light hits light-sensitive cells, and the light-sensitive cells create a little charge Those charges then go down the nervous system. They stimulate neurons. The neurons form patterns and so on. So basically those neurons, those light signals, those little bumps of electricity created by the light, that's just information. When you smell or hear or touch anything, it's just data. Okay, data is information. Then you interpret that information. And you interpret all those little electrical signals and neuron patterns you interpret as this reality. Okay, so that's what this reality is. It's just information. And an interesting thing is that information is not physical. You can't weigh information. You know, how heavy is information? How much space does information take up? You know, what's the volume, you know, that holds information? Well, there is no space or volume, and that means it's non-physical. Information is the content. Now, of course, you can weigh a book, and it takes up space, but the book is not information. The paper is the media. Okay, the ink provides the code symbols, but the information requires interpretation of those symbols into meaning, and that can only be done by a consciousness. You take a picture of the book, take a picture of the page of the book, and the camera doesn't get any information. It's only a consciousness that has to decode the code symbols written on the media. Then the information's created in that consciousness, in the mind of that observer. So information exists only in consciousness. So what is this reality? It's just information. Where does this information exist? In consciousness, you see? So that's kind of a way of helping you see that this idea that reality is information is not all that far-fetched. Now you get down to the quantum mechanics level, and the people in quantum mechanics have known a long time that reality is information. You know, it has to do about their experiments revolve around information. Information is sometimes called measurement. And they also know that the fundamentals of reality is information. Many of them struggle to somehow pin that structure onto objective physical reality, but it doesn't stick. And that's why they think quantum mechanics will never be understood, because there's the way it acts, which is as information and non-physical, and the way they believe that it ought to be, which is objective and physical, are at odds with each other. And that's the quantum mechanics' weird science problem. Mm-hmm. So first thing, we have reality's information. Second thing is that this information exists in an information field, and we can model this information field as being digital. Why? Because, you know, digital is the simplest way to generally portray information, and binary is the simplest way to generally portray digits, you know, bits, if you will. Now, it's not the only way. You don't have to work in binary, and things can be, you can have analog information, but it's very limited. If you want an unlimited resource, then you end up with a digital information field. And let's call digital information field a computer. That's what computers are. They're kind of digital. The computer, it's hardware, it's hard drives, it's memory, it's processing, all works inside of a digital information field. So now we're beginning to see that reality, our reality, kind of looks like a computer, and that this is a virtual reality. Now, we all know about virtual reality. We have virtual reality games. Two I know about are the two that my children played when they were young, and one of them is World of Warcraft, and the other is The Sims. Right? The boys play World of Warcraft, the girls play The Sims. That's generally the way that works. So you have these virtual realities, and they are generated as information inside of a digital information system. Okay, so all those the pixels light up on your screen because of information. There's some information that tells which pixel to light up at what intensity and at what color. And all that information then creates this world on your screen. So that's a virtual reality. By virtual reality, we mean virtual as opposed to it's computed. And, of course, the opposite of that, well, if it's not virtual, it's real. Well, if it's real, we think that means physical, that this physical reality is the real one, and that The Sims is the virtual one because we create it in a computer. But then it turns out we have to take one step back and realize that our reality is also virtual, and that we are created in a computer. And that
just to explain, Tom, I think a slightly clearer explanation of virtual is that the virtual realities that these characters wander around in is one that's created from the re-expression of a single algorithm to create the textures and the surfaces rather than actually defining each point on the surface. Mm-hmm. Would that be a more specific description of virtual?
Yeah, well, there's different kinds of virtual reality, and actually, I'm getting I'm going to confuse your audience. Let's put it this way: there's different ways to make a virtual reality. Now, when you make a virtual reality like The Sims, that's done with algorithms that specify the way everything's supposed to look. Now, that means that things like grass, you don't have to plant each blade of grass. You can have, just like you say, a reoccurring algorithm, or it can just kind of look like a green carpet where you don't show individual blades of grass or individual strands of hair on furry critters. So that's a programmed virtual reality where some programmer sat down and had to create information or algorithms that created information for all the points on the map, if you will. All the points inside the virtual reality had to be generated by algorithm or by a computer programmer putting them there. Now, there are other ways to create a virtual reality that, like our virtual reality, what we call physical reality is a virtual reality, but it was created quite differently. The way it was created is it evolved. It's not a programmer that plants every blade of grass. It's an evolved reality. So you take, let's say we take a lot of energy and we confine it to a very small space, and we give it certain rules about how this energy relates, how energy transfers have to be made. So we give it the basic rule set of how it will interact, what it will do. And we put all this energy in a very tight space. Now, this is a computer simulation, right? So we're just simulating it. We can say how small the space is, how much the energy is. Those are just input values. So we make this computer program, and then when we punch the run button, we let all the logical consequences be computed based on the rule set of how this virtual reality interacts. What are the energy exchanges between the particles or the elements in it? So they push the button, and that's what's called the big digital bang. So that in the computer, in that simulation, that ball of tight energy expands. As it expands, it cools. As it cools, one of the rules is, of course, gravitation. Chunks of it tend to coalesce. And eventually, of course, you end up with our universe, and then you end up with us on a little planet going around a star, and our own evolution locally on this planet. All you need is the right kind of amino acids and get together, and you end up with some kind of very vague, maybe virus kind of thing, or a cell of some sort, and then the cells get together and decide to cooperate, and then you have multi-celled things, and so on up the chain. You have this reality that has evolved in this computer. All of it is just evolved in this computer. Okay, so that's the framework then for our reality. Well, then what are we? We are consciousness. We're individuated units of consciousness, and we are going to kind of play in this virtual reality, just like my daughter played in the Sims reality. We're going to go play there, and the way we do that is that we have to follow the rule set for this reality. We can't do things that the characters, can't do, and they're constrained by this evolved reality frame. So let's say in this evolved reality frame where we had the little spot of energy and it expanded, we ended up with the universe, we ended up with our planet, we ended up with human beings and all that sort of thing. And these human beings, let's say, can only jump 3 feet in the air. They can't jump 20 feet in the air. Why not? Well, according to the way they evolved, their weight, their muscle structure, and the way they're built won't allow them to jump 20 feet in the air. So this consciousness has to abide by the rule set. It can't do things that are, let's say, not supported by the results of this simulation. So if this character gets hit over the head by a crowbar by a villain and it damages his brain, oh, well, you've just created new constraints. So now that character can no longer think as well as he did before because now he has brain damage. So there's more constraints added because of the energy of the blow and how much energy it would take to crush the skull and so on. All of that just goes by the rule set. So what is this rule set? Well, it's our science. At least science has dug out, a lot of the rules. There's still some rules that it hasn't dug out yet, but it's dug out a fair number of them. And those are the rules called physics by which our reality works. So here we are, consciousness. We're playing in this game. We're being constrained by this sets of rules, and it's a multiplayer game. So it's interactive, just like Sims and World of Warcraft. It's interactive. You have different players. You have players run with a computer, and you have other players from all over the world who have kind of paid their $10 a month and have signed on, and everybody can interact. So if another player walks in front of you, you see them walking in front of you. Why? Because it's just information. The information knows where each player is by the way the player moves and where they're located and that sort of thing. And it knows where you are, and it knows what's in your vision, and it displays that. So that's the same way it works in World of Warcraft and Sims is the way it works here. So that's the first big paradigm that's very difficult for most people to get, because at a deep level they have learned from their culture that physical reality is real and it's solid, and they probably even believe that it's kind of all the reality there is. All reality is contained within our universe. Well, that's like saying that all the world is flat. You see, it's a mistake. It's taking something that appears that way, but really isn't. The world really appeared flat, but as far as you could see, it seemed to be flat. Because you don't know what you can't see. But in any case, that's the first big paradigm shift. You have to understand that reality is virtual and that it's information. And science, now where's physics on this? Science has come a long way to supporting this. Every few months I hear about some other physicist someplace who kind of signs on to the virtual reality paradigm because it's just better physics. It explains things much better than the old physics, which, physical reality is all there is, and it's objective.
Well, and also is riddled with paradox and nowadays a large degree of scientific dogma.
Yes, exactly.
And
so they have all these paradoxes, things that do happen that shouldn't happen, and you have a very strong science house like Princeton, who has this group of people that are kind of an offshoot of Princeton, and it's called PAIR, Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research. And for the last, 25, 30 years, they've been doing research showing how mind affects matter. They use people, they use their graduate students and so on that have their intent focused on changing a particular thing that, according to the physics, shouldn't change. They can bias statistical distributions and that kind of thing with their intent. And this has been going on, like I say, for a long time. The scientific protocols are immaculate. They're probably 10 times more, stringent, 10 times more precise. Yeah, more conscious of possible errors and conscious mistakes than general science, because they know these answers are impossible. This can't happen. It's something that we don't know. So because it's doesn't have any theory to explain it, they are very, very careful about controlling their error sources and controlling the protocols. So their scientific method is probably the best and most rigorous in the business. And yet they consistently show that these things work. Now, That's one of these, conundrums. Like, how is that possible? Well, if you understand virtual reality and our reality as a simulation, and then the next step, the next paradigm is understanding that this simulation is probability based. It's not, nobody's calculating every pixel, in our reality. It's all based upon probability and statistics. And then when you understand both of those things, then suddenly what's going on at Pear Labs is a logical conclusion. Well, of course it's that way. It has to be that way. It couldn't be any other way. So we come to our second paradigm, that our reality is probabilistic. And the way it works, and the double-slit experiment told us this. It very clearly shows us that reality is probabilistic, that's how it works, and that it's informational. But quantum mechanics has kind of gone on with the computation and denied the foundation, that it is not understandable. So let's talk about that a little bit, because I want to then get to this next paradigm about it being probabilistic. In double-slit experiment, and if you want to see pictures of this rather than just listen to me talk, you should go to one of the videos on YouTube. You can either go to my channel, which is TWCJR44, that's TWCJR44, or just go to YouTube and put in Thomas Campbell, and you'll come up to the site, and you will find lots of videos, and almost any of the workshop videos will have a section on the double-slit experiment, and a couple smaller videos I discuss it. And what it amounts to is that if you have a barrier with two slits in it, two holes cut in it, and if you throw a particle through one hole, you expect it to hit the background, which is on the other side of the barrier, right behind that hole. And if you throw a chunk of matter through, either one of those holes, you would expect it to land behind the hole that it went through. That's the way matter is. It's what Newton told us, that's the way matter works. And indeed, if you measure where these electrons, let's say the particle is an electron, if you measure these electrons, which hole they go through, that's exactly what you get. You get a little pile of electrons behind each slit. Now we're firing electrons at these slits one at a time. So if we measure which hole, here's this electron and went through this slit, and it ends up in a pile right behind the slit, and so on. But if you don't measure which hole they go through, you just let that electron gun just fire away, and firing one electron at a time, you end up with a diffraction pattern. They don't end up behind one slit. They end up spread in a pattern that looks like a wave pattern. So that was a big question back in the very early 1900s, is how can that happen? How can these single particles distribute themselves like a wave would distribute its energy when we're firing them one at a time, one particle at a time at these two slits? The answer to that is that the particle isn't really a particle. See, here's where they found out that their belief that an electron was a little chunk of mass with a charge, that was an inference based on their measurements, and they believed that it must be true. And then they got their comeuppance when they got the quantum mechanics, when it turned out it just was not true, that it was just a model, and it wasn't even a very good model, because it didn't explain the results that they were getting with the double slit. They realized that electron was probability. It was a probability distribution. It had a probability of being somewhere, and some of that probability went through each slit. The probability interfered with itself like a wave, and then where there was high probability, you got a particle sometimes. It's probabilistic. Sometimes you get one at this spot, and sometimes a spot a little further over, and sometimes another spot based on probability. So they realized that particles are really probability, and that when you don't know where they are, when you haven't tracked them and know that it went through this slit or that slit, then they act like, they're not particles. They're just probability. They're probability waves, and that's a fundamental assumption of quantum mechanics. If you understand the bigger picture, then you realize that everything is probability. It's not just, electrons. Electrons are the ones that are obvious because, because they're so small, they're easy for them to get lost. you might say. It's easy for us to lose track of them to where we don't know where they are, and then they're described by probability. In the larger world, that's a little harder thing to do. So this turned out, this became obvious at the level of subatomic particles and atomic particles.
And that's really the key
reality. Well,
sorry, Tom. That's the key paradox that I was just alluding to, where really to accept the modern scientific model, the paradox of the double-slit experiment and its the inexplicability between the wavy particle that has to be assumed to exist for both experiments to be right is just kind of shrugged and walked away from by mainstream science at this point. It had no answer, often no answer, and literally just kind of carried on building its model on such shaky foundations.
Right. Well, they have actually no foundation at all. They just know it's a fact. And they take that fact and go off and say, well, if that's true, then what are the logical implications? And they've worked up a system of mathematics that explains what those logical implications are, and that's what quantum mechanics is. It's this mathematical formalism that computes, other than, experiment says that it's a fact. But why should the world be like that? Why should reality just be probability? Well, it's just information, and it's information within a probability and statistical model in a virtual reality. So you see, it's starting to make sense, and things. The foundation under quantum mechanics then starts to firm up as, okay, we understand that reality is information, and it's probabilistic. Well, that's good, and it also solves the pair research lab solves their problem as well. Mm-hmm. So now our next step on this series of paradigms that one needs to kind of crawl through in order to see this bigger picture is to realize that we as consciousness interact in this reality frame. And the one of the ways we interact with it, and I guess I'll have to then backfill to make this reasonable, but one of the ways we interact with it is that our intent, the intent of consciousness in this virtual reality, actually modifies the probability of what will happen in this reality. Okay, so intent modifies the probability. So imagine you have this reality, and it's based upon probability. And you have beings that are playing in this game, and the things that happen next, okay, there may be 100 different things that could happen next. Some of them are more or less probable than the others. Okay, then a statistic, you kind of reach up into this distribution of the possible things that could happen and all the probabilities that they might happen, and you randomly pull out one. Okay, and the things that are more likely to happen, of course, are more likely to happen, because that's the way, that's what it means to be a statistical distribution. So you pull out this random value, and that's what happens here. That's what you get. And then once you have it in this reality, then it has to stay. The reality has to be consistent. Otherwise, it's not a very good reality if it's not consistent. You can't have different people in the reality, seeing different things. You have to have it consistent. So that's one of the rules that we follow, that once something comes into this reality, it has to be physical. It has to abide by the rule set that creates the simulation that we call physical reality. So then that means when they measure that electron at that slit, the measurement is the act where you reach into that probability distribution and pull out an answer. You see, we don't know. It's just probability. Where is it? So we measure, and we make the measurement. We create information here in this physical reality, and we say the particle is right there at that slit. It's just going through this slit. That's information. Now that is what the physicist would say collapses the wave function, and this is a probability wave function, collapses the probability wave function to a physical particle. From then on, it can't do anything but act like a physical particle. It has to travel in a straight line, until it hits the screen behind it. So it's the act of measurement that, if you will, kind of creates the particle there, and then it has to act like a particle afterwards. That in physics is called the measurement problem. The measurement problem is a problem because it shouldn't work that way. You shouldn't create particles by measuring.
By measure. Mm-hmm.
You see? So that is why they call it the measurement problem, because it's another one of those impossible things that don't make sense. It does make sense very easily if you see yourself in a virtual reality that's run by probability and statistics. Now, the things that they do at Paralab that we've mentioned, they use their intent to modify those probabilities. That's the part that they have shown to be, a fact. They can use their intent. They set up things that produce random distributions. And then somebody's intent, like a radioactive decay. So you have a radioactive source, and it'll decay in some random direction. And then you have Geiger counters that count, did it decay into this Geiger counter, into that Geiger counter? It's exactly the same probability that it'll decay into either, because it can decay in any direction. So you just have counts on these two different Geiger counters. And after a while, you'll have millions and millions of counts if you let it go long enough, and you would expect them both to be about the same. Well, if one was, a couple more than the other, then you kind of expect that, because over time, they would tend to be the same. Uh-huh. But they let somebody, after they collect that data, or even as they collect it, they can let somebody have an intent that, say, the left Geiger counter will get more counts than the right one. The right one will get less and more and that. So it'll be traded. Some of the ones will be taken from the right one and put to the left one, if you will. Some of the decays is going to decay preferentially then in this one direction, which physics says is impossible. It's a random decay. But sure enough, they can do that. They can modify, they can get probability distributions that show a statistical significance in the inequality of the counts in the two detectors. Well, this detector now has, more. And what's the probability that it could have gotten that more just kind of by accident? And it's like, 1 in a million, 1 in 100,000 that it could have gotten that more just by accident, by random fluctuation. So they know it's a real effect. And intent, conscious intent, modifies the probabilities. And the reason for that is it's a feedback mechanism that helps us interact with this computer simulation game we call physical reality. And to understand why we would have this feedback, you have to understand now another paradigm shift, which says, what is consciousness? What is this consciousness system? And what's it doing? Why does it act like that? Well, consciousness system is a digital information system. What do digital information systems do? Well, they create and deal and move information. What is information? You go into information theory, you will see that randomness, which is all the bits are just random, has no information. If you take those bits and put them in some sort of a pattern, that's called information. You see, because no longer it's random, it's in a pattern. So what information systems do is that they decrease their entropy. Entropy is a measurement of order. So you take all the bits and they're random, there is no order. That's very high entropy. If you take those bits and arrange them in some sort of a pattern, like take those bits to, spell a word or a mathematical equation, now you have order. And that order is information. So how digital information systems exist is by creating and maintaining information. That means by lowering their entropy. If their entropy gets too big, they just become a bunch of random bits, and they don't, they're not really a system anymore. They have no function. They don't do anything. In order to be a system, then they need to do something, and to do or interact, they have to lower their entropy, create, maintain, share information. Well, these systems evolve. So a digital information system, if you have the potential, let's say you just have a potential of a system that can just differentiate between state A and state B, some system, some potential energy that can become aware that there's a difference between state A and state B in itself. Well, that's a 1 and a 0. Then all you need to do is have that system become aware that there can be, multiple ones and multiple zeros. And then you can put those ones and zeros in different patterns and orders, and pretty soon you can create information and patterns of these bits. And then you can create time, where time allows you to have a before and an after. You can change things. You see, there is no such thing as change. The word change has no meaning if there is no time. Mm-hmm. Change requires time. So then time is a new technology to this information system. And with time, it can have sequences of patterns, you see. So it puts a whole new dimension on how it can lower its entropy. It can sequence things. So the creation of time is basically just an awareness of difference, of change, is you can do it this way and then you can do it that way. Oh, well, this way was prior to that way. That defines time. Mm-hmm. And eventually, in order to make sequences of patterns so that they make more sense and have lower entropy, you want to have regular time. And you have regular time, that means something has to change states, like between a 1 and a 0. 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0. Well, that's a metronome or a clock. So this system can what should we say, evolve its own clock, its own concept of time and change, and produce patterns of patterns and sequences of patterns. So that brings us up to something like a digital computer, you see. But this digital computer is conscious, because it's able to modify what it does in order to decrease its entropy. Now, it's just evolved to do that, just like the cells. You had cells and they evolved to be whatever, fish, and then alligators, and then, birds and reptiles and things like that, ending up with people. How did it do that? Well, it just kind of did what worked. You try things by kind of randomness. Things just happen. And if they happen and make you more survivable in biology or more able to procreate, then those things go forward. And the things that don't do that, die out. That's the way evolution works. Well, in a consciousness system, a digital information system, things that lower the entropy go forward, and things that don't, things that increase it, die out because they're counterproductive, you see. So you have the same thing. All you need to start with is a potential that can differentiate two states. Now, that's an assumption. You have to start with that as an assumption. Given that as an assumption that a digital information system we call consciousness evolves, that's just a matter of evolution. Just like in biology, we start with an assumption that somehow a cell could create itself just by circumstance and chance, perhaps, somewhere, and after that, we ended up with cells that split and multiple-celled and specialization of cells, and everything else follows. So that's assumption number one, is that somehow there was a potential that could differentiate state one from state two. And the second assumption is that evolution exists, and evolution is just a process by which things that work go forward, and things that don't go away. So it's a very simple process. All kinds of things evolved. It's not just plants and animals evolved here, but technology has evolved. Lots of things evolve. Monetary systems, governments, philosophy, cultures, they all evolve, and some of them, devolve as well, which means go to higher entropy states, less functional. So that goes on all the time. You have random events that take place, circumstances that take place, and then the system adjusts to deal with it. That's how evolution works. So this whole theory just is built out of those two assumptions, and from those two assumptions, everything else follows as a logical deduction. Okay, so here we have this system, and it's a digital information system. It's trying to evolve. Why? Because it doesn't want to die. If it doesn't evolve, it's going to, get to the point where it's all randomness and not exist anymore. So it's got this dim awareness that we call dim consciousness, sort of like the dim awareness of maybe, an amoeba. So it's not the It's not the brilliant consciousness that we think of ourselves as being. This is just a very dim awareness, but it's able to evolve. And it grows and evolves and makes multiple cells and gets technologies like time and etc. to where it's now this very bright, this very intelligent digital information system. Now, how is it going to do this evolving? How is it going to know how to get lower entropy? Well, this is a information system. This is a system that does what? Communicates, creates information. So its natural thing to do is the same as biology did. It divides. It what do we call it? Partitions off part of itself, and now there's two of them. Just like a cell divides, and now there's two cells. And these two now can interact and exchange information. Now you've got a huge, larger probability of novelty and new things going on because you've got interaction between two independent things, you see. And then that can happen again and again and again. You end up with lots of individuated units of consciousness interacting with each other within this larger consciousness system. Well, okay, that's what you and I are. We are individuated units of consciousness. And we need to lower our entropy, because if the system doesn't lower its entropy, the system dissipates, goes away, becomes random. So we're parts of it. We need to evolve. As each of the pieces evolve, the whole system evolves, because the whole system is just all the pieces. You see?
Yes. Yeah.
Plus some maybe administrative stuff that kind of does the housekeeping off on the side. So we are the system. The system is us. It's all one big system. Yeah. You may have heard that someplace in metaphysics. We're all one. Well, you see, that's actually true. So here we are, and we're in this, we're individuated units of consciousness, and what's our mission? To lower our entropy, to evolve the quality of our consciousness. Okay? And how do we do that? Well, this is now as a group of individuated units of consciousness interacting with each other. We now have like a social construct. It's chunks of consciousness interacting with other chunks of consciousness. Well, what's the optimum way that a chunk of consciousness can interact with another chunk of consciousness? What optimizes that? What lowers the entropy? Remember, lower entropy means more order. Okay? It's a higher ordered thing, and increasing entropy is less order, more randomness. So you kind of think of one as building and creating, the other one is kind of destructing and dissolving, if you will.
The way that I learnt to conceive of entropy was of things, the kind of directional arrow of time driving things from hot and simple to cold and complex.
Yes, that's a pretty technical definition, but that was the original definition in thermodynamics. That's where the term entropy comes from. It comes out of the second law of, it comes out of thermodynamics. And the second law is that the entropy of the universe is always either has to stay the same or decrease. And we know that it can't stay the same. That's not practical in our world, so it has to decrease. But that's a different subject. So anyway, so here we are with these things, and they're trying to lower their entropy. They're in a social construct interacting with others, and as it turns out, the most optimum way, the most constructive and building way to interact with others is with caring, is with love, is with compassion. And the most destructive way that creates more randomness, that tears down rather than builds up. So construction is more order, is lower entropy. The way that tears down is through fear. Fear creates distrust. Distrust makes it difficult for these individuated units of consciousness to interact with each other. Fear makes an individual say, well, what about me? I need to make sure I have all the things I want. I need, my stuff, as it puts the person at the center.
Yes.
Whereas love is about other, you see. So fear puts a person in the what about me, we call that ego. And love puts a person in it's all about others. It's about somebody else. It's not about me. how can I be of service? How can I help other? How can I help the whole? You see, that's the cell that's now in a multi-celled creature saying, how can I help the whole? You know, what's my part here? It's a cooperative, supportive effort of all the players involved. So that's the low entropy solution. So now we see that here you are an individuated unit of consciousness, and what is it? Is your purpose? It's to evolve. It's to survive. It's to lower your entropy, and you do that by becoming love. So now I'm starting to sound like a Buddhist, aren't I?
No.
It's all about love, you see. Maybe I'm sounding like God is love, you know, sort of thing. But now it's very metaphysical, we see. But now love becomes just a logical consequence of the nature of reality based on two assumptions. One, that consciousness exists, the other, that evolution exists. Out comes individuated units of consciousness who are interacting and optimize their evolution by becoming love, which means by becoming a low entropy entity.
Yeah.
So that kind of, we've gone now through about 4 or 5 of these paradigm jumps that you have to, you know, and that's a lot, you know, for your listener. You know, I'm giving you a new paradigm jump like every 15 minutes, you know, and usually one of those in 5-year period is about all we can handle. So one every 15
like I say, I think you'll find we've primed our listener exquisitely. They're absolutely keeping up. They're all showing a huge interest and massive support for the show.
Yeah.
Wonderful description from Tom Campbell. Great guest.
That's good, because if they were just hearing this for the first time and trying to follow it, by now is when they'd start to get the headache.
We've got hundreds.
This is where the pain would start. It starts to get overwhelming because you've got so many new paradigms you're trying to string together in a logical way. So now we've kind of gotten to all these paradigms. So here we are. How do these individual units of consciousness do this? How do they become love? Well, by interacting, right? Well, how do they interact? Well, they could just trade data, but that's a very sterile kind of, abstract kind of interaction. Think of a chat room. Think of a huge chat room, and you got 100,000 people in this chat room, and all you know about them is their made-up username. That's it. You know nothing else. Mm-hmm. And you're having chats with them. Well, what can you get out of that? And let's say there's no rules in this chat room. You can do anything, say anything, you can get away with anything you can get away with. So how much value is that chat room? It's not much value, because you can't depend on anything you get. You have no idea, you know, what's going on. You're starting a relationship with some big lumberjack who lives in the Northwest, and it's really a 12-year-old girl who's playing with you, and she lives in New York City, you see.
Yeah.
You don't know. So it's hard to build relationship in this very abstract sharing data space. So what do we need here? Well, we need something less abstract. So let's create this virtual reality. Let's start this simulation with this little ball of high temperature, high energy, and then let it expand. And we'll let that thing go in the computer until it evolves our universe with our star and our planet and all the other stars and all the other planets, and us too, as probability. See, it's a probabilistic model. So here we are, and it's all probability. And now we're consciousness. We want to interact. We need a place that gives us traction so we can form relationship and learn and grow. Some much better space than this very abstract, just data sharing space. So here's this world, this universe we call physical reality. It's really a simulation inside this larger consciousness system, which is a digital information system. And it's here for the expressed purpose of individuated units of consciousness like you and I to come here and interact with the computer stuff and with each other so that we can learn to become love and let go of fear. Okay, let go of ego. Now, out of fear, you got a bunch of things that kind of drop out of fear. Fear creates ego, like we said. It creates belief, because you have fear that you don't know or don't understand or don't have the answer, and it's an important answer, so you come up with a belief to make you feel better. fear creates needs, wants, desires, expectations, all this stuff, and that gets in the way. So now I'm beginning to, sound like a whole different class of writers, right? Who maybe conversations with God, or some other writers like this. Maybe Seth Speaks. I'm starting to take on a sound like a metaphysician, but we've still just done this by logical deduction, if you will, from those two simple assumptions where we started.
Yes.
Okay, so now here we are, we're interacting, we're in this reality where we as consciousness can kind of play a character, right? We can play this character in this reality, and all our character is really a set of rules, things that the character can and can't do. Well, what's the character in The Sims like? It's the same thing. Those characters in The Sims have to follow certain rules. They can't jump 20 feet in the air either, because they're programmed to act like humans. They can't breathe underwater. Your Sims character falls in a swimming pool and some bad girl's pulled all the ladders out, like my daughter used to do, and they can't get out of the pool, so they drown. Those things happen. In World of Warcraft, if you don't know how to swim and you fall in the water, you will drown. So here you are abiding by the rule set of this game. So whether it's the World of Warcraft game, the Sims game, or the physical reality on Earth game, it's still this physical reality, and you have to abide by the rules, which is the rule set, remember, is our science, has dug out a lot of those rules, things like gravity and Newton's, remember the things we called Newton's laws, those are all basic statements of rules in the rule set. Mm-hmm. So that leads us to, what is our purpose? Why am I here? What is my purpose? Big question. Well, your purpose is to lower your entropy, which means become love, which means evolve the quality of your consciousness, to grow up. That's why you're here. And the way this game works is, stuff happens, you have to deal with it. You deal with it by making choices, and depending on the quality of the choices you make and how to deal with it, you move closer toward becoming love, evolving, or fear, de-evolving. So if your choice is to get angry and throw a fit, or draw your gun and shoot someone, or whatever, try to grab all the marbles and run, then you're making bad choices, and you're not doing so well in your game. If your choices are on the caring, compassionate side, then you're doing fine and you're growing. Okay, so that's kind of the nature of the reality here. So it's been kind of a long talk. I've got about 10 minutes left at the end, so I think I'm going to throw it back to you, Jack, and see where this summary needs to have patches and holes that I've left in it.
Okay, well, certainly it's been a remarkably complete description of the logical steps that one needs to take from perhaps the assumption that the current scientific model is accurate, to one of realising just how broken it is, and to understanding how more precise, less paradox-ridden the MBT model is, and how many different fields it is applicable to, and how in the drawing of those fields together that we may come to an entirely new understanding of our place in the world and our ability to affect our surroundings directly. And I think that that's certainly something that I'd love to get into in the last official hour of this show. My co-host for the 3 hours following this show has graciously given us leeway to take as much of the music show as necessary to complete this subject. So we do have free rein here. But one of the very, very minor, almost feel foolish even bringing it to the table, because it's really only an issue of semantics, of the use of language. But one of the issues that I've had with many of the concepts that have required the use of the word love is that in the context of MBT, I personally see a more precise description of what's actually the the action through reality that's being described there is more a beneficence. Because when I see, the universe is love, that for me doesn't explain the whys and wherefores of, say, warfare. Whereas beneficence would then allow for, if the warfare was more beneficial to more people and acquired more novelty as a result, then it would be seen by a benign universe as beneficial.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that we end up in this theory with things like love having a technical definition. Love is one of those things the poets say cannot be defined, but in this system, love is an entropy measurement, right? It's a low energy being is love. So what's your love quotient today? Well, it's like saying what's your entropy level today, as far as a individuated unit of consciousness. So love becomes.
Oh, I'm sorry, Tom, you've just
dropped
out.
When I was developing the theory, I thought, well, isn't that nice?
Tom, sorry, you just dropped out for about two or 3 seconds there, just as you were finishing your last sentence.
Okay, I thought that was particularly interesting when I finally got to that point, that love, this kind of magical word that means so many things to so many people, actually has a very precise and technical definition in terms of entropy.
Yes, absolutely. Well, there's certainly, like I say, it strikes me that in a universe where an asteroid can wipe out the majority of the life forms on the planet at some point in our digital history, surely that can't necessarily be seen as an act of love. And yet it would have driven the vast expansion of biological evolution immediately prior to that mass extinction event. And then surely one could see that as not necessarily a loving event, but certainly as a very beneficent event.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. It's the way that morality boils down in this scheme is that, if you want to know whether something is moral or not, it's whether or not it lowers or raises, the entropy of the system. So that's basically it. If what you're doing is, or what is happening, increases the entropy of the system, then that's bad. That's disillusion. That's de-evolution. If it decreases the entropy of the system, and I would say that in a long term, if it's a long-term decrease, then that's good. So now we also have a technical definition that defines what's good and bad and what's moral and immoral. And in fact, my son, when he was in college, he's a philosophy major, he took that concept out of MBT and developed an entire ethical system based on it, which is the only ethical system I know that so far answers all the mail and doesn't have any fatal flaws in it.
I have read that on your website and would strongly advise anybody wanting a grounding, possibly even something to show to your children as a means of giving them an appropriate moral grounding without the need for religious or sociological or cultural dogma. It's a superb work.
That's a real neat thing, because here we have physics deriving ethics and morality. Well, how is that? See, that's one of those neat things, that when you really do understand what's going on and how it works, everything kind of comes together, and everything is really a part of everything else. So here we have ethics and morality and love, and all of them are derived out of this kind of fundamental physics of a virtual reality and consciousness and the probability models. So it's a neat thing where all of these things that before were like unrelated and disparate things that just don't go together, like science and like physics and metaphysics, like science and philosophy, they're at opposite ends of the pole. Find out they're really not opposite ends of the pole at all. They're just all different viewpoints of the same thing, and a good understanding, a good physics drives them all. Derives theology as well as explains the double-slit experiment.
Like I say, removes the mysticism from what are experienced experienced events. For many of us, with you, with the transcendental meditation. For myself, with the temporal lobe epilepsy, which with experience that falls outside of the model that we're given. In the absence of that larger model, we have to go seeking that model. And in my mind, you have constructed an absolute paradox-free working model that we can all use in a practical sense as well. And perhaps that's something that we can come on to in the next hour, is the practical applications of MBT, which in my mind are just mind-boggling.
Okay, we're almost to the hour, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a song lined up, so if we'll go to that, because this is a convenient point, give our listeners another comfort break. And ladies and gentlemen, we'll be back with you immediately after this tune and on around about the hour of 11 o'clock GMT. Okay, we're back with freemanjack and Bitchin' Bob with Dr. Thomas Campbell live from America. Been an absolute cracking show so far, and we've got some sort of Q&As lined up for Tom, which will hopefully just blow the lid off this subject even more and just explore the parameters of this subject. So I'd like to sort of title this last hour or last segment Practical MBT or Practical Plastic Reality. One thing that Bob was just asking there was the implications of the search for the Higgs boson. Bob, do you want to ask Tom your question?
Yeah, sure. Tom, no, I was just asking, with the search for the Higgs boson being, big headlines recently, whatever, a major event, could that outcome of the Higgs search be biased by the scientists' collective intent?
Absolutely. If you have a whole lot of people with an intent that things are going to be a certain way, then if they can meet the conditions of being that way, and we can talk about that in a minute, then certainly it raises the probability that they will be that way.
Yeah.
So we have a very plastic, a very fluid reality because it's a probabilistic reality. It's not a deterministic reality. It's probabilistic, and there's just a couple of criteria that you have to meet in order for something to be possible here, and that is that something that comes into this reality, one has to obey the rule set. So we don't have things that flaunt the rule set, because it's like The Sims and World of Warcraft. All the characters and everything that happens in those games have to abide by the rules. Secondly, there has to be historical consistency. So you can't have a discontinuity in history. You see, there needs to be a continuous history. So the things in the past have to affect, the things that happen next. So you can't just have, you can't go into your house in London one day and then turn around and walk out the front door and, you're in Germany or Australia or someplace. You see, that would be a big,
nothing.
Yeah, that's a big discontinuity. So you can't have that. You need to have, consistency in the history, and it has to abide by the rule set. Now, actually, that's just one criteria. I list that as two, but if it abides by the rule set, then it must have consistency. I mean, consistency will be there if the rule set is obeyed. So it's really just that one rule, but I like to put it in two different parts because people can conceive of it better that way. So anyway, as long as having a Higgs boson doesn't violate either of those rules, if there could be a historical consistency, and there could be, because there's nothing that says it's impossible, then all we have to do is have it be consistent with the rule set, and then it's possible. And if it's possible, if you have a lot of intents focused on its happening, then its probability of happening goes up. Yes. So this way we're creating this reality as we go. You see, this reality we're in is a continuing work in progress, and we continue to create it as we move through it.
And would you suggest that it would be a powerful influence on the probabilistic future reality field of investing? I think it was 11 billion, wasn't it? 11 billion euro in the Hadron Collider.
Sure, that might raised that probability too. A lot of people hopeful.
And an awful lot of physicists basically gambling their entire careers and works on the back of that.
And there's some people who don't like it. There's those people that say, the Bose particle is not necessary. There's other ways to solve the problems, and they think that it's not so likely, and that would be kind of weight on the other side. And besides that, there's all sorts of things the larger consciousness system might want to do with it. It might want to, it may think that it would be good for the whole if after spending those billions of dollars, they come up with, they're forced to go to a different worldview instead of continuing this particle worldview that they have. Right. So it may turn out that more particles into the particle view of the world, which we know is not an accurate view of the world. The world isn't particles, it's probability. Double-slit told us that. Mm-hmm. So it may be that it's time for a big goose egg to push thinking in another direction. Well, if you just did that and spend $1,000, nobody would care. But if you do that and spend a few billion, then that gets everybody's attention. So hard to say how it'll come out. There's lots of things that are probably pushing that probability one way or another.
Well, I tend to think of it in terms of your work, especially the discovering of the mass of the Higgs boson will be akin to knowing the precise weight of your Sims character.
Science is kind of, because it doesn't understand the nature of reality, they tend to work themselves, paint themselves into corners, and then they have to come up with these extra, you'd call them fudge factors, I guess, if you're on one side. If you're on the other, you'd call them discoveries. But they come up with these fudge factors that allow them then to maintain the fiction of an objective reality. And things like, dark matter. You see, that's one of the equations don't balance right if you don't have this other big, force someplace. And because the equations must balance if you have an objective physical reality, then you can make something up to force them to balance, and you call it dark matter. Now suddenly there's a whole another thing out there, and all it is it's a concept that enables you to continue to use the same model that you've been using to this point. So they get to points like that, and they have so much belief and confidence in their model that if the model requires dark energy to work, then there must be dark energy, and then you go off on a search for dark energy. And indeed, like you say, if that's not impossible, you may even create it. So it's a real squirrely world we live in, and there's lots of possibilities. And physicists are kind of infamous for making things up to get them out of the corners that they painted themselves into.
Okay, just sort of on the practical side, just before we came back to air, I was saying how before coming across your material, I was essentially living an MBT life where I learnt at a very early age that I had the ability to project police cars into my path to pull me over and to inquire about the contents of my pockets as a youth. And I learnt at a very early age how to stop projecting police cars into my path because of the frequency with which I managed to make it happen. And without the construct to explain that, again, I reverted to mysticism and took it on board as a belief simply because it worked. But again, you're bringing a description of this kind of probabilistic statistical future reality field where our beliefs in the here and now will actually have a direct impact on what comes our way down through that sort of probabilistic pipeline. Would you like to kind of expand on that?
Yes, and we see that all over, in all sorts of fields. Basically, that's what's going on over at Princeton, at Pear Labs, when they have people using their intent to skew, distributions of things like, we were talking about the Geiger counters, things like that. That's that intent that's modifying the future. We also have that we've known things. Educators have done some research that says that if the teacher is told that their students are particularly bright, their students will actually do better, end up doing better on standardized testing, just because the teacher believes that they're bright. And if the teacher believes that they're substandard, that they're not too bright, they will end up doing worse. And if you actually tell the students that as well, they'll do much better or much worse. So if all the students are told, you're the slow group, things are a little hard for you, so we're going to try to make it easy. We're going to put you in this slow group. Then you'll find out that even though they were just average students that were picked at random from the student body, you'll find out they will do worse. So just the teacher by herself by himself will make a difference to the outcome of the class. In other words, the class won't score as well on their standardized tests, won't do as well as far as their intellectual capacity goes.
And to my mind, Tom, something that you illustrated, I think, in the Calgary seminar, that the conviction of an oncologist in his ability to cure his patient's cancer has a direct impact on his statistical liability of curing his patient's cancer.
Absolutely.
And you go further than that to actually suggest that the reality of the cancer doesn't collapse out of the probability field until your doctor tells you about the existence of that cancer.
Yeah, see, that's the way this reality works. It stays just like the particle, just like this electron. They stay potential particles. They're just probability, a probable or potential particle until the measurement's made. So it's just a probable or potential tumor until the measurement's made. Once you make the measurement, that collapses the probability to a tumor or not, because now you've got the biopsy, and when the guy looks at it under his microscope, it's a tumor or not. So you've taken the measurement. But up until that point, it's just probable. Now it may be very probable, or it may be slightly probable. Probable just means that it's not a done deal. It's not fixed. It's not an objective fact. But this is also done. We have the thing called the placebo effect. Talking about medicine, where you give people, medicine that isn't medicine. It's sawdust or sugar pills or something that has no medical value. But you tell them that it's a terrific cure for what ails them, and they get better. And it's not that you're just fiddling with their minds and they think they're better or they pretend they're better, but they actually get better, against a control group that wasn't told anything like that. So the placebo effect is so integrated into our medicine that medicines generally cannot be sold to the public until they have beaten a placebo test. And that's getting harder and harder for the drug companies to accomplish. They have to go to other cultures in order to get their drugs to beat the placebo test.
Well, I was going to say, to that point, Tom, had you heard that the placebo effect has actually multiplied fourfold in the last decade?
That's correct, yeah.
That the placebo effect is now 4 times more potent than it had been any time in the previous decade.
Yeah, and part of that is our belief in medicine. Now we have our televisions are full of commercials about, take this drug and you'll live happily ever after. Take that drug and your heart problem will disappear, and so on. So we've built up all of these expectations. Well, that's just like telling somebody that this sugar pill is going to, help them get better. We build up so many expectations and such a confidence that science can cure it. Science can cure everything, anything we can imagine. Want to travel in time? One day science will figure it out. We have this irrational belief that science can produce all the answers. And because of that belief, then the placebo effect, we get particularly susceptible to that. We find all these claims very credible. Whereas other people do not.
And also the nocebo effect, the contradictory state to the placebo effect, the effect that causes whole cabins of airline passengers to fall ill because somebody's been heard being sick in the toilets and fish was served for lunch. and the whole cabin will suddenly start to be sick, and there'll be no physical cause.
Yes, that happens as well. Now, another a study that brought to life a fact that the doctor's bedside manner will make his ability to heal greater or worse. So those doctors who actually kind of relate to their patients as human beings, give them encouragement, explain what's going wrong, pat them on the heads and become part of their healing thing, rather have better healing rates. They cure people, better and more often than doctors who say, well, you got this wrong with you and that wrong with you, probably won't do you any good, but you can try this medicine. If they have that attitude, then they don't have a very good healing rate. And they found that just that by itself made a difference between a good doctor and a poor doctor.
Mm. Well, a question I want to ask you there, Tom. The good intent, is that would that explain? Well, in your opinion, I don't know whether you're a religious man or whatever, but with religion and you get so many people praying in prayer groups and they've had positive outcomes and definitely influenced. Is that not just another example of the good intent? Yeah.
That is exactly another example. So is it, the psychic healing. You can heal with your mind if you can focus your intent for that outcome. Mm-hmm. So it explains all that sort of thing. It explains synchronicity, that things just happen at the right time, at the right place, and the way you expect them to happen, or the way that you need them to happen. It explains things like, the power of positive thinking. Those people who are just positive and they go about life positive generally do much better than those people who are negative and go about their life in a negative, woe is me, everything happens to me kind of attitude. It usually does happen to them.
That's
people
right.
Who are very fearful end up, maybe they're fearful that a policeman is going to come out from behind a hiding place and catch them, like Jack there. If they're very fearful, they create that situation.
Yes.
So absolutely, you have a whole program that just, some years ago called The Secret, which had to do with, quote, programming the universe to give you whatever you want. And that is basically the same sort of application. It has nothing to do with programming the universe. I mean, what does that mean, programming the universe? It basically has to do with modifying the future probabilities to change. You have control over that, of what happens. It just means you can modify the probability. So if that probability started out to be 10 to the minus 10, which is 1 in 10 billion, which is not very probable, you might work real hard at it and get it all the way up to, just 1 in a million, which is still not very likely, but you've moved it a huge amount.
Could we possibly do like an idiot's guide to affecting the future probability field?
Well, sure. You want me to kind of tell people how to go about doing that?
It would be nice to at least personally, I find that to maximise the effect of intentionally acting upon the future probability field is, like you say, to be acting from love, essentially. And that if you're acting with, again, I use the term beneficent intent, and if your view is outward, then generally speaking it would appear that the future probability field is happier to reward that. And so from that perspective I would suggest that yes, it is possible to affect your future outcome, but that the effect seems to be much greater if you're wanting to do it for the benefit of somebody else, even more so for everybody else.
Yeah, and the reason that's true, that is one of, there's several parameters that make it more or less effective. The one you just mentioned, it's more effective if your intent is a loving intent, and the reason for that is the consciousness system is about decreasing entropy. It's about becoming love. And if you are doing things that are requiring the system to work against itself, in other words, to embellish ego, to embellish fear, you're using your intent to create more ego and more fear, then you're asking the system to work against its own best interest, to work toward its de-evolution, and the system won't like that, So the system's not going to be very helpful there. Whereas if you are asking it to do things that are moving the system toward more or better evolution, then the system will want to encourage that. Now, we talk about the system encouraging or discouraging. Well, this is an intelligent system, right? This system has evolved and able to produce virtual realities that we can play in. This is not a stupid system. So using it to aggrandize your ego, often, that's going to come back and slap you in the face. You might actually get what you want, but you may get it in a way that you wish you hadn't started the process.
Indeed.
Why? Because the system is likely to want to teach you a lesson that will help you eventually lower the entropy of the system rather than raise it. So we have a couple of things in play here. One is the system and its willingness to help. Two is your intent and how focused your intent is. So if you just make a wish, I wish I were rich. I wish, I didn't have to walk so far to get to the store. These kinds of things, that's not going to change much. You have to first learn how to get the noise out of your mind so that your intent can be clear and well focused. Your mind's not flying around. So that's one of the parameters. Another parameter is that you have to realize that what you're trying to change has its own natural probability, and you can only change things within that natural probability, and you can only move them so far with your intent. It's also cumulative. So if you work on this thing, 10 times a day, you'll be 10 times more likely to move the probability than if you work on it once a day. Or if you get 10 people together, we're talking about the prayer circle, 10 people together to focus their intent on something, then you're going to have, if all 10 of them are equally capable of focusing and clarity, then you'll have 10 times the effect if you have 10 people working on it. So some people are tremendously more focused and clear than others, and some, so there's a lot of variables in play, I guess. And
then to empower those two other forces, shall we call them, you also have the example, like we say, of building the Large Hadron Collider as being a vast material input and external input into that belief field. And that this is my thing, is that as well as having that sort of fixed intent and the belief and the focus in the first place, that you have to act externally with these things in order to empower them into the real world?
Yes, you have to act. Yeah. Well, what you do when you focus and what you use your intent, you're not forcing something to come into our virtual reality. You're just raising the probability that it will come in to our reality. Now, then it gets to the point of, well, what was the probability to begin with? If it was, if it was almost enough to get into reality, then your nudge will be enough to make it go. If it was extremely unlikely, then your nudge may or may not be enough to make it go, or you need a more powerful nudge.
Well, you have a fine example in one of your talks about securing a parking place if you're going to the theatre of an evening.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Dennis Menerick gave me that. That was the fellow that I mentioned earlier. As he and I started out, with Monroe in the beginning of Bob building a consciousness research facility, and Dennis said that one of his favorite things to do was to produce a parking space for himself, because where he went to work was in an urban area. There were probably only a quarter as many parking spaces as there were people that wanted them. So a turnover was very quick. A car would pull out, and within 10 seconds, somebody else's car would pull in, and that's just the way it always was. So it was very hard to get parking spaces. And he would start out in the morning, before he even left home, in his mind, using his intent to create the situation where just as he got to the street in front of his office building, somebody would pull out and he would be able to pull in, that a parking space would just become available just as he got there. And he found out that it was about 80% he could arrange that. And I imagine the other 20%, it's because the situations were not such that the system could manipulate them to give him that parking space. In other words, the probability was too low to begin with, that couldn't successfully be manipulated. But with, say, 50 or 60 cars in his view that he could pull out and give him a space, there was generally somebody who was maybe just about thinking about going, that that changing that probability would just hurry them up a bit, just kind of move them on their way, so they just got there at just the right time. And that sort of thing works. People call cabs in the same way. They'll go out on the street and they'll have an intent that a cab will just be, just around the corner, will be coming by any time now. And it makes a huge difference in whether or not you get a cab.
I certainly have completely stopped believing in London's traffic and its ability to gridlock. I spent years convinced of London's entire ability to gridlock on a regular basis, and subsequently spent my entire life driving in London gridlock. Having convinced myself of its non-existence, I frequently find myself driving across London as if it's 5 a.m. in the middle of the rush hour.
There you go.
So these are kind of practical applications. We've got a real sticky subject arising in the chat box. We have a few incredulous minds now that we go slightly deeper into the subject. I mentioned in answer to somebody's question that your thoughts create external objects, and our 100th monkey came back with that he can't agree, and that why do I say that it does? Well, perhaps Tom may be better at explaining how your mind literally creates the stuff and substance that you think of as reality and external objects.
Okay, well, again, your mind, your intent creates a change. You can raise or lower the probability of something happening. So let's put it that way. Now, if something is not likely to happen, like let's say you are outside on a very hot day in the middle of the summer, and you would like to have an ice cube appear in your hand, you see the probability of that happening now isn't very high. So even with a lot of intent, you probably aren't going to make that happen. Now, doesn't mean that it is impossible. It just means the probability is low. See, almost nothing is impossible. Things are just improbable or very probable. So in that case, if you had someone who had very, very strong focus and intent, maybe they could do that, but there would be restrictions because we have this thing about consistency, right? They couldn't do that, let's say, if they had invited all the cameramen from the news to come down and watch this ice cube appear in their hand. They would not be able to do it because now they would be creating a discontinuity in the rule set in public in front of lots of people, and it wouldn't work. Now, if they could go someplace private where nobody was looking and they had a lot of their own personal clarity and focus, maybe they could do that, but nobody would believe them because everybody said, oh, you're just making that up. And now suddenly the probability of doing it, you see, increases because they don't have this added inconsistency issue, you see. So probability can go up and down based on circumstances. It can go up and down based on the individual. So if we have something, we don't say that anybody can make anything anytime they want. It's not like that. It's just that the probability goes up and down with various things. One of the little things I do in my talks is the man in the woods, and this maybe will give you some idea of how things are created or not created. And it's a simple little example, and that is that you have a person walking into a woods that nothing is in. So this is going to be a virgin woods, doesn't have any bugs, doesn't have any critters, doesn't have anything. It's just a woods. So this is not a practical thing. This would not actually occur, but it's a thought experiment. All right,
theoretical woods.
Yeah, it's a theoretical woods. It's a thought experiment. So we just have this woods. And why is the woods there? Well, the woods there is because it's probable. And this person walked over this land that nothing had ever seen before and popped over a little hill and looked, and there he saw a woods. The reason he sees the woods is that it's probable that woods were there. So when he looks over the woods, the system has to give him some data. He's taking a measurement. What is he going to see? Well, there are maybe a lot of things that he could see that are possible, and some are much more likely than others. And when he makes that random draw, he picks one, and let's say that it's a woods. Now, once he sees the woods, the measurement's been made. They know which, it's like you know which slit the electron's at. After that, it has to stay in this reality. So now there's a woods there. All right, so he walks over to the woods, and let's say he walks into the woods, and what is he going to see? Well, again, you see, we do this whole thing over again. What he sees depends on what's likely, what's possible, and what's probable. And of all those things, there are distributions. When I talk about distributions, think of like a histogram under a probability curve. What that means, we can do this in a simple analogy so you'll get the ideas, because I'll keep using this word. You reach up and take a random draw from a distribution. Most people, their eyes glaze over and they don't exactly know what that means. But think of, we have a distribution, and let's say we'll say this distribution will be reduced to the number of let's say the number of pieces of paper in a hat. We're going to do like the random drawing by picking a piece of paper out of a hat. So in this particular distribution, we're gonna pull and see what is likely to come out. And let's say there are 1,000 pieces of paper in this hat that have the number 100 on it, and then there's maybe 500 that have the number 20 on it, and maybe there's 20 that have the number 10 on it, and maybe there's 1 that has the number 1 on it. You see? So that's your distribution. All those numbers of things. That's how those numbers are distributed in there from 1 to 100. So when you reach out and just take a random distribution, what are you most likely to pull out? Well, 100. There was 1,000 of those in there. Pulling out the 1 piece of paper that had a 1 on it, there's only 1 of those in there. So that's one in. You have to sum up all the numbers of papers we did. So let's say there was 1,000, then 500 in them. So there's about, say, 15 or 1,600 in there. So it'd be 1 out of 1,600 that you'd pull that 1 out. Mm-hmm. So that's what I mean by taking a random draw. So some things are more likely than others, and you take a random draw about the things that are likely. So you walk into this woods, and you take a draw, and you say you see a certain set of trees, certain kinds of bushes. Was it a deciduous forest, a conifer forest, whatever? That has to do with the probability. What's likely to be there? Okay, so you take that draw, and then you come in and you say, well, here there's a dead tree in this woods just off to my right where I walked into the woods, and that dead tree is about to fall over. So that was just a random draw of defining the woods. Mm-hmm. So now you walk out of the woods, so that woods is going to be there. When you turn around and come back, you'll find the same woods. You walk back in the woods, you'll find the same dead tree, and everything will stay the same. That's because you need consistency. Okay, but let's say now in this, to kind of give you an idea how this probability works, let's say this person walks out of the woods after seeing the dead tree, and he comes back 5 years later, and he sees a tree laying on the ground. Did the tree fall over? Well, no, the tree didn't fall over. When he was gone, nobody else looked at these woods, so these woods weren't being rendered. There was no reason to render the woods. The only reason you think the woods had to consistently be rendered is because you believe reality is objective and physical, and everything that's there has to be rendered all the time. It doesn't. This is a simulation. Okay, this is a virtual reality. Your people walking around in The Sims and in World of Warcraft don't have the whole map rendered to them all the time. Only what they're looking at. The computer, the server, only sends data out if there's a character in the game looking at something. So let's say there's no characters in the World of Warcraft game. There's just this 1 minute when nobody's there. What does the computer send out to people? Well, nothing. There's nobody there to send it out to. So it's not rendering anything. It's just potential in a computer. Then somebody signs on and they pop up in some area. Well, then it renders that area to them. You see, that's the way the system works. So when he comes back later and he sees the tree on the ground, did the tree have to fall over? No. The tree then gets rendered on the ground because that's likely, because before it was dead and wobbly, and it's the probability of it having fallen over because of storms and other things that are probable in that area was such that when he pulls that random draw out now, when he looks, he finds a dead tree laying on the ground. So no, it didn't have to fall over. Once it's rendered standing up, the next time he looks, it's rendered laying down. You see, so that's just the way it works. Now, people get confused with this, and they say, well, okay, there's a tree in a park, and, all the people go home and go to bed, and nobody's looking at the tree. Does the tree disappear? Well, of course, the tree doesn't disappear. The tree was never there in the first place. You see, the tree is just data that's being sent out to individuals. If there's nobody there looking at it, then there's nobody to send a picture of that tree to. There's no user online to send to render that tree to. So it's just not rendered. Now, if somebody gets up and goes, looks, then that person has a tree rendered to them. If they set up a camera, then that camera sees the tree all night long sitting there. That's rendered. Okay, that's part of the reality.
Can we move
so it's
from
not
here,
just.
Can we move from here into the effect that consensus and how objects that appear to be sustained through generations, how those objects may be rendered into reality consistently, and how perhaps that's driven by a degree of cultural consensus about that reality. I was thinking of the everyday objects like tables and chairs, how they remain tables and chairs without necessarily the observer to create them.
Well, once something comes here, like once that electron is measured at a particular slit, then that electron just keeps, can only then act like a particle that's physical in this reality frame. In other words, it becomes information within this reality frame, this physical frame, and it has to act under the way the rule set would have it act while it's here. It can't violate any of the rules. So it's the same with everything else. If there's a table or a chair or a thing and it's here because it's being rendered here because somebody built it, somebody bought it, somebody's sitting on it, whatever, then it's rendered here. It can be used just like things rendered in the video games that we play. And, it can be passed down from one family to another because as long as it's here, it's here. So what's the probability? So let's say you close the door, everybody leaves the room, and there's nobody in that room. Well, is there any reason for the system to continue rendering that table and chairs that are in that room? Well, no. But that doesn't mean anything. When people walk back, it gets rendered to them again. You see, it's not like, well, they're there and then they disappear. They're not there and disappear. They never were there. We're just talking about data. This is a virtual reality. There are no tables. And tables are illusions.
And this is a wonderful explanation as well as to how things like car keys can appear to migrate. And that you've got a wonderful term called strong history. And that the car key conundrum is largely driven by the absence of a strong history about where you last left them.
Exactly. If you have car keys or glasses or things and you don't know where they are and you're looking for them, okay, and if you really don't have any idea where they might be, then where you find them, how does the system decide where to render them when you go to find them? Okay, well, it doesn't know because there isn't any strong peaks in the probability distribution. If you say, well, I hadn't been in any of these rooms all day. I've only been in these two rooms, so it's not in this one. It must be in the other one. Now there's a pretty good probability distribution that's headed for having it in, one of those two rooms because you just haven't been in any of the others. But if you don't have that sort of probability, and it's just as likely that they're on the nightstand in your bedroom or in the drawer at your desk, then it's kind of a random draw there, and you could get one just about as easily as the other. So you think it's odd that you put your keys down someplace and then it's random where they turn up again. That's just because they have a weak history. Remember, we only have to satisfy this idea that the history has to be continuous, you can't have history jumping around. And if there is no history, then there's a bigger uncertainty, and reality will will accommodate that larger uncertainty with a wider range of possibilities. So that's why that works. So when you lose your glasses and you look and you can't find them, that may be because they're, you just don't remember. There's no data anymore where they are. And particularly if the system is trying to convince you that reality is larger than you think it is, so it's going to do a little demonstration here, you may find them in one of those rooms that you didn't go in. And then it's like a big mystery. How did that happen? How could that be like that? I found them so-and-so, and I never was there. Well, the idea is that, reality is stranger than you think. Strange things can happen. I've known people whose stuff disappears and then reappears in drawers and places.
I've experienced it personally.
Yeah, just part of their life. It happens that way. Well,
Tom, I'm mindful of of suffering from patricide after the show. If I don't ask this question, it's been posed by my 20-year-old son, who, like I say, introduced you to me via your YouTube work, and so, like I say, has shown possibly a more intense fascination with your work than even I have. And his question is around the subject of out-of-body experience, and again the practical applications, and he's asking what are the possible benefits of out-of-body experience, and if more could be learnt about physics in the out-of-body experience and necessarily in so-called real life.
Well, kind of yes and no. There's more to this question than just a simple answer. First, let's say that out-of-body experience is unnecessary for growing up and evolving in the larger consciousness system. You can do that. What's necessary to evolve and to grow is that you become love. That's the key. You lower your entropy. And if out-of-body experience can help you do that, in the sense that it can show you a bigger picture, which opens your mind and lets you see kind of a larger view, but it doesn't have to be. Some people get there even though they don't have a larger view. They still get to the point of becoming love, even within their constraints of a smaller view. So you can evolve in almost any circumstance and any surrounding. So I'd like to make that clear. Sometimes people say, doing these paranormal things is the only way to grow up. I need to get these powers. Well, that's mostly ego speaking. It's not necessary. On the other hand, if you're curious and you'd like to find out about things for yourself, then remote viewing or out-of-body experience is a real neat way to demonstrate to yourself that reality indeed is just informational and it's probabilistic. And you can do this in many ways. You can get to an out-of-body state, or, again, remote viewing, or just a meditation state. The differences between these states are more a function of belief and the restrictions that you put on them than there are actually any real differences between them. It's more of the direction that you get to them from than it is anything unique about the state itself. So when you are connected to the larger consciousness system, let's just put it that way instead of calling it remote viewing or out-of-body or lucid dreaming or whatever. If you're connected to the larger consciousness system, then you have access to a tremendous amount of information that you don't have access to here. It's not information that's in this physical reality. Part of the way this reality frame has to work, part of the mechanics of it is there is this future probable database, which we've been talking about. There's also an historical database, which is all the data of everything that did happen and everything that could have happened but didn't, and the probability of it happening. So we have these databases, and from those databases you can glean great deals of information. When we look at somebody's aura and we see that aura around them, we're just getting data from these databases. When we do let's see, what's the word, diagnosis of somebody, okay, we're going to look at somebody's health aura or health energy body or whatever we want to call it. These are all just metaphors. You want to look at somebody's health energy body, then what you're doing is focusing your intent on this information. Your intent is like the query into the database, and you get information back. If you can lower the noise of your mind, and if you can get through all your limitations of your beliefs, et cetera, and you get this data back. You can also get technical data. You talk about, can you learn physics there? Well, I came to my theories based on experiments done in the larger consciousness system. The only way to tell that historical database is not, can we say, it's animated all right. It's just like being there. It's like, watching a movie or being part of the movie. But you find out that there's no free will in it. It's just history. It's history and probability. There's no free will in that database. Yes, you can go there and have discussions with people who have lived, but you're only getting the history and the probability view of it. They don't have free will. And how did I find that out? Well, I had to do experiments there. I had to change variables and see how the change of variables resulted in changes in the answers. And you do enough experiments, you can learn things about how the system works. So you can do science there. Your experiments are repeatable, and you get, real information. And if you are a left brain kind of person that likes to deal with the world in logical, structure, then that sort of thing may be appealing to you. If you're a right brain person and you kind of deal with reality in wholes, in big chunks, you probably don't like logical structure, and these sorts of things are probably not all that interesting to you. You kind of don't need that structure. You just jump to the big picture conclusion without having a logical pathway there. But I'm a physicist, so I'm a scientist. I like logical structure, and that's why I kind of took that particular route. But all of this information is available. Now, again, just like we were talking about, it's available to you, but if you misuse it, if you try to use it and gather it for reasons or intents that are focused by your ego, good information back. The system doesn't necessarily have to cooperate. You have a system, but the system is intelligent. It's not a dumb system. It's intelligent and it's evolving. So you also have to interact with the needs and wants of the system if you want, which is basically to lower its entropy. So there's some variables in there that make it a little more complicated than just you're the only actor and the system is like a big machine that must respond to you. The system can respond to you in different ways based on its sense of what's good, for lowering entropy of the system. Does that answer the question, or do you want me to?
No, I think that answers it. I think that will answer it admirably. Thank you so much, Tom. And you covered so many subjects tonight, and even in really just the last 10 minutes, you've kind of touched on so many of the themes that run through your seminars on YouTube. I know you mentioned in an email that you would consider coming back for later shows. Would it be possible to put you on the spot now and ask if you would consider coming back for more shows later on?
Sure, absolutely.
I'm minded that, like I say, it's late here in England, and our listeners are beginning to be eroded by the late hour, and I'm minded that we've already had you on for nearly 3 hours now. Would it be possible to kind of book you for some more of these 3-hour sessions and possibly use each one to explore more fully the realms that you touch on of remote healing, remote viewing, and I heard you talk about suicide earlier, and that's a particular matter that's very close to my heart, and a large part of my broadcast is trying to prevent suicide under the current kind of economic climate.
Sure. And we can talk about some reverse causality. That's something that often is very interesting. Those two Geiger counters we were talking about earlier, that the people at Pear Labs can change the amount of counts, or the ratio of counts in the two Geiger counters. They can take that data, and a year later they can use their intent to modify the information, of that old data. and that's called reverse causality. It's not really reversing causality at all. It just has to do with the statistical and probabilistic nature of the universe, and those have been done many times as well. So there's a lot of things to talk about, a lot of applications that are kind of fun.
Well, Charlie says thank you for the answer, so I assume that means that you answered it adequately to his satisfaction. Bob, I'm minded, have you got any other last questions that you're desperate to get in with, Tom, before we hit the top of the hour?
Well, actually, I'm very interested in whenever you were talking about OOBE and whatever, and it was a question that had been asked by one of our regular listeners who can't be present tonight, and he did say if I could get a slot in with you. He wanted to know about the pineal gland, and does any of your research, from Monroe laboratories or whatever, point to any connection between it and consciousness?
Well, remember, the pineal gland is a virtual pineal gland, just like you have a virtual brain and a virtual body. Okay, right. And the pineal gland then is a part of that evolved system that we call physical, that simulation that defines the what we can and cannot do and the structure of our physical world. Mm-hmm. So it's a physical. It's a virtual pineal gland, but it has ramifications about what the body can do and what the body can't do. So it's connected to what the body will support. In other words, your mind here in this physical reality, as a human in this physical reality, you are constrained by what the rule set will support, and that constraint is in the form of your body. Okay, so like I say, you can't learn difference equations and advanced calculus all in 5 minutes, because your brain just can't do that, because it's limited by the rule set of how it evolved. Well, your pineal gland gives you certain capabilities, and if you get rid of it, some of those capabilities are gone, you see. So yes, the pineal gland is a significant gland. It does affect the way the brain processes information. Well, I didn't say that right, did I? It's a virtual brain. The brain really doesn't process any information. The brain just develops the constraint, in other words, the capacity that you have for processing information. The information is all processed in consciousness, not in a virtual brain. The virtual brain just sets the limits of what can and when cannot happen. It's part of that virtual simulation that we're in. It's a very complex thing to describe very quickly. Maybe next time we'll have more time. I see we're within minutes of having to...
Don't worry too much about the hour coming up. Like I say, we have an entirely fluid schedule here. Like I say, I'm merely concerned for your voice and for the listeners' brains, which I'm sure must be letting off a little steam by about now, and hopefully we've shifted so many paradigms so far that it will take a week or two for us to be able to shift them any more with any significant force.
I find that people tend to get this in little bits. So I have people that have read the book 7 or 8 times, and each time they find stuff in it that they never found before. And that happens with the things on YouTube. They'll watch them, and they'll watch them again, and then they'll watch another one that's similar, and then all of a sudden they hear things that just didn't click before, and they think, well, I've never heard that before, but yes, they did. They just weren't quite ready to make those connections yet. So it is an iterative process.
Well, funnily enough, I described the most peculiar experience of watching your videos, and the only other time that I've experienced it has been reading 2 books, both of which were of huge significance to me. One was Anton Wilson's Illuminatus, and the other one was James Joyce's Ulysses. And both of those books had the effect of transporting me, that I couldn't actually stay within the confines of the plot or the page, but that the information that was being given to me would take my mind on such wonderful journeys of its own. And I often find myself watching your videos and just going off on a complete kind of logical sort of tangent, and then finding myself kind of drifting gently back into what's being said, realising that I've probably just been away for 10 minutes.
Yeah. Kind of listening at the being level rather than at the intellectual level.
It's certainly an interesting effect that I can only imagine must come from, all three of you having thought very deeply about your subjects. It's the clarity with which you express them as well. Both myself and Bob have been taken by the simplicity. Obviously, there's a level of jargon that has to be required when you start to use sort of quantum effects as your proofs. Then it's very hard not to descend into the sort of scientific jargon. But in essence, your explanations can be condensed into a simplicity that really any 12-year-old should be able to grasp. And like I say, with practical applications that if we apply to our everyday-to-day life, I think we haven't even touched on the matter of beginning to become monitor of your own thoughts and careful of what you wish for in some degree, and the potential power of collective thought, where if perhaps the more minds applied to a subject, the more likely it is to happen that if we collectively agree on a future that we would prefer, that we may be able to actually influence the outcome by our collective focus on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's been some interesting experiments in that direction. I think they're called the Maharishi experiment, something like that, where a group of meditators, a group of people tried to modify the crime rate in an urban area. And through their effects, they could get statistical significance from the crime rate going up or down based on their either trying to decrease the crime rate through their mental efforts or not doing that. And there was clear statistical, in the how the crime rate went up and down basis of what they did. Was good correlation. So those kinds of experiments have been done.
So we really do have a whole raft of practical applications still to explore using the premise of MBT as a model, and like I say, that these extend into health, possibly into ways of changing society without the need for violent revolt or bloody revolution, and certainly ways for people suffering from poor mental or emotional health to see a way clear of finding a way from where they are now to somewhere that they would prefer to be in their kind of emotional well-being.
Well, one thing I might say, if some of your people are still hanging on out there,
we still have plenty. It's only the most moderate of erosion due to the hour.
Okay. Well, one thing I would like, you said that there were some people basically were skeptical and were having some issues. That's good. People need to be skeptical, and I'd like to make that point. I don't have these talks and kind of do these interviews with the idea that I can get people to believe what I say. That's not the point at all. You should be skeptical. It's important to be skeptical, and don't accept anything that you don't have your own information to verify, because if it's not your experience, it's not your truth. And you cannot carry around somebody else's truth. So skepticism is important. If you're not open-minded, you never have an opportunity to learn anything, because if you're closed, that's it. You're closed. You're not going to learn. So the key is to be open-minded and to be skeptical. That's the only process that will get you to a better understanding. So it's not a problem when somebody says, well, this doesn't make any sense to me, and here's why. They should be thinking that way. If it doesn't make sense to them, then they need to look at it.
We haven't done our job.
Where's the problem?
Yes.
Okay, well, again, Bob, you've been a fabulous co-host, and again, an absolute star for bringing Tom to the airwaves for us all. It's just been an absolute delight. Tom, you are. I would love to adopt you as my father. you can be adopted as my spiritual father if you like. I never could have imagined being able to feel such a completeness with and comfort with the model that I now work with in order to describe my reality. And as an epileptic, that has led me into so many dark places in my life that would just have been completely unnecessary in the firm knowledge of your MBT and its consequential outcomes. So, I mean, if we can bring this to people before they reach that